afternoon. This is Mr. Hammond-Beyer, and this is Lecture 2 in the Nervous System on Cranial Anatomy. Okay, so what is the function of the brain? Why do we have a brain? Based on the first lecture in this series, what would your answers be? Something about sensory input, processing sensory input, integrating that, and determining a response, and instigating or instituting the appropriate response for whatever that sensory input was. Think about this from everything from paramecium to snakes to lions to human beings. They all have a brain, and the brain's function is basically the same. Okay, so what are the major regions of the brain? Well, if you remember back when we studied the skull, there was the front of the skull was the frontal bone. Well, it's the frontal lobe right below that. On the side of your brain, you have the temporal bone. Well, you have the temporal lobe underneath that temporal bone. On the top was the parietal lobe, underneath the parietal bone. And in the very back, you have the occipital lobe. And then back in the very back of your brain is the cerebellum. And the brain can be divided into the left and the right hemisphere, right down the mid-sagittal plane. And the brain stem is the very bottom of the brain. So here's the front of your forehead, and here's the back of your head. So frontal, occipital, parietal, temporal are the four major lobes, and then the cerebellum and the midbrain and brain stem are in there. Okay, take a second. Make sure you can label those. If you need to look up some other diagrams, whatever, go out and make sure you can label all of those parts. If we look at outer brain parts, so we have the frontal lobe, which is this entire, in humans, is this entire frontal part from just behind the midline all the way forward. Behind that is the parietal lobe, behind that is the occipital lobe, and over on the side is the temporal lobe. Okay, the frontal lobe is also quite often referred to as the cerebral hemisphere. And in the cerebral hemisphere, at the back end of that, there is what's called the central sulcus. So a sulcus is a groove, a singular groove, sulci, for many grooves. So here's the central sulcus. In many animals, it is much farther, and when we look at the sheep's brain in a few minutes, you'll find the central sulcus is way up here. But with humans, because our cerebral hemisphere is folded and pushed farther forward, our central sulcus is a little more posterior. Then right behind the central sulcus is the postcentral gyrus. A gyrus is a bump or a ridge, and the sulcus is a groove. So right behind that is the postcentral, and then the precentral is the bump or ridge right in front of that central sulcus. And then there is also a parietal occipital sulcus and a lateral fissure. So what's the difference between a fissure and a sulcus? A fissure is much deeper. Those much deeper. Sulcus or sulci are shallower grooves. Take a few minutes, and this is about a 5-minute video. These ladies will take you through these parts in a little more detail. Pause the video, go ahead and go to this website, this YouTube video, and pick up a few other details. Now, if we look at the embryological development of the brain starts as what's called a neural tube, a fold of tissue in the developing embryo. And by 13 weeks, you can see the beginnings of what's going to become the major parts of the brain. So there is the brain stem is established. There's the midbrain, the diencephalon, and the beginning of the cerebellum, and the cerebral hemisphere. And notice the cerebral hemisphere here is actually going to fold back on itself. By the time we get to our adult brain, here you can see the parts inside. So here again is the brain stem, the pons and the medulla. Then going into the diencephalon, or the midbrain. And here's the cerebral hemisphere. There's your central sulcus. And back here is the cerebellum. Okay. What about the external anatomy of the brain? Yeah, most of it is highly convoluted. So the ridges are gyri, gyrus is singular, sulci or sulcus are the valleys. The very, very deep ones are fissures, just to review this stuff. And then there is a continuous layer or laminated sheet of neurons on the upper 2 millimeters that's called gray matter. Here is an example of this. Here are these sulci, a gyrus, and a particular sulcus. And here is the gray matter in this section right here. This right? All right, and here's a fissure, a much deeper groove, and that is between where we've taken is the temporal and the frontal lobes. So here's this where that piece came from. So this is the lateral sulcus and fissure. Here's your central sulcus and precentral gyrus and postcentral gyrus, and the parietal lobe, etc. Okay. Down here at the tail of the brain becomes the spinal cord, but the medulla oblongata is the first swelling of that, and then it goes to the pons. So coming out of the brain it's pons and then medulla, vice versa. Okay, if we look at a sheep's brain in cross-section, we can see there are all kinds of internal parts. And if we look at the human brain in cross-section, we can see many of those similar parts. So here's the cerebellum, as it is there. Here's the pons and the medulla. The pons and the medulla. Then we get into the diencephalon, or the midbrain, which is this section right in here, which includes the hypothalamus and the thalamus and the corpus callosum. Those are all parts of the limbic system, which we'll talk about in a little more detail later. Cerebellum's back here. Here's your central cortex, or cerebral cortex rather, which is all right here. So here's the corpus callosum. Here's the ventricle. In the first lecture I talked about how there was not a lot of blood flow directly into the cells, and so there were ventricles that were circulating cerebrospinal fluid. Here is one of the ventricles, and here's another one back here, or a cavity. Okay, if we look at a sheep's brain in a little more detail, so we look at a whole brain. Here's an example of a whole brain, and you can notice that there are some layers around the brain. There are three major layers that cover the brain. There are the arachnoid matter, the dura mater, and the pia mater. This is the dura mater, the white, rather tough layer around the brain, and that protects the brain from shock and trauma. If we take the brain in cross-section of the sheep's brain, you will see that, all right, so here is the ventricle right in here. Let me get it. Okay, so here's the ventricle right here, which is this section right here. Here's the cerebellum back in the back, and the pons and the medulla, which are right here, are right pons and medulla, and then going into the spinal cord. Now if we look underneath the brain, it shows the optic chiasma right here. In a real brain, it's a little bit more obvious because there's this big bundle of fibers right here. That bundle is going out to the eye, so the optic nerve comes in, and the optic chiasma is where the incoming nerves cross. So information from your right eye comes in the optic nerve, crosses the optic chiasma, and goes to the left side of your brain on the optic tract. Vice versa, input from your left eye comes in the left optic nerve, crosses at the optic chiasma, and goes to the right side of your brain via the optic tract. Okay, here's the frontal lobe. Notice the frontal lobe on the sheep's brain is much smaller proportionally than in the human brain, and the central sulcus is right here, much closer to the front, so it's right up in here rather than where it was in the human brain. So there's more folding and development in this section in the human brain. Okay, let's let's look at some of those midbrain structures. So here's the corpus callosum, and here's the pons and the medulla down here. Right above that is the thalamus. And what's the job of the thalamus? Think of what's happening here. Nerve impulses are coming in from the spinal cord. They have to go someplace and be directed. So think of the thalamus kind of as the router for the brain, because most things coming in, it's a large mass that basically processes sensory information and sends it to the appropriate parts of the brain. So it kind of is a relay site before it reaches the cerebral cortex. Right below, so here's the thalamus. Right below the thalamus is the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is also a relay station to an extent, but is much more involved in functions including homeostasis. When you're hungry or thirsty, that's the hypothalamus is letting you know that. Also, if you stay up until 4 o'clock in the morning, especially during COVID, or 6 o'clock in the morning, because your circadian rhythm is altered, that's a function of the hypothalamus. And it also has some control over autonomic nervous system, so when you're hungry, etc.